Fritz was a very warm and generous individual, and the environment of his restaurant reflected this. It was called Deux Cheminées, which means two chimneys. Actually, in the second version of Deux Cheminées, there were many more fireplaces. There were about 6 in the dining rooms, and it was always called one of the most romantic settings to have dinner in Philadelphia. So he created a very warm, inviting environment. The house, the townhouses the restaurant was in were these wonderful old Victorians with big high ceilings and terrific decorations. It was very high Victorian style. You felt like you were going into the home of some eminence of the last century. And in fact, you were going into the home of Fritz Blank. He lived on the 3rd floor. He had an apartment there. And then on the 2nd floor, he had his library. So it was, you were really coming into his home. And that feeling came across. And after dinner, often as not, he would come to the table and sit down with you and ask you how things were and did you enjoy it? And then if he had something on his mind, he might gripe or tell a joke. It was a very welcoming environment and made people want to come back time and again. He had a very loyal clientele. He made them feel welcome. So I think that was his secret of, in addition to terrific food and very high standards and a wait staff that he kept an eagle eye on. I think that's the warmth and hospitality of the place made it a great success for over 30 years. I would say the main thing we had in common was a kind of insatiable curiosity about the world of food. Fritz had this enormous library that in the end he gave to Penn, the University of Pennsylvania. And he read many of the books he had, I would say most of them. He was a walking encyclopedia of food lore of all sorts. And as a journalist who got into journalism out of a kind of visceral curiosity about the world, and someone who liked to pick up the odd fact and the interesting story connected with an event or a dish. We were kind of a natural match, and we began to exchange information back and forth. We emailed almost daily. He would fax me or email me things that he had discovered about food history, food science, whatever that might be, or a little bit of gossip. As readers will find in the book, he wasn't above enjoying some gossip about his fellow chefs or the food scene, or giving his opinion to whoever asked or didn't ask about what he felt about this or that. We just were turned on, you might say, by how broad and how complex and how enriching this whole food world could be. And we both reveled in it. Apart from kitchen skills, I would say, though I've touched on it before, how important food traditions are and how accessible they really are. When I moved here to New Mexico, I immediately began looking for cookbooks that would tell me something about the traditions here the culinary traditions of New Mexico because I suspected, and Fritz had led me to believe, that every place you go, and especially a place like New Mexico with the kind of history that it has, would have a very deep and rich food tradition. And sure enough, at the Ghost Ranch, I found a cookbook by a woman named Romero, whose family came from Albuquerque. I found it an extraordinary book and an example of someone who knew exactly where to go to find out what her roots were about. And I was thrilled to discover this. But I would not have had my antenna up for this sort of thing if it hadn't been for Fritz. So as a result of that book, I've broadened my horizons, so to speak, in New Mexico, and have come to know this cuisine better, this culinary tradition, the ingredients. And now wherever I go, I look for that. I might, in a restaurant, I might ask the waiter or the chef, if I get to meet the chef after the meal, where did this dish come from? Is this something that, are you from here? Is this something that you learned to do here? Did you pick it up some other place? I like to find out the provenance, which is kind of a high-priced word, of a dish. The way you find out about the provenance of antiques, of furniture. Just about everything you eat, you can find has a story, and I love those stories. I would say something collaborative. I like going to friends' houses with something that I have made or partially made, and then we complete it there, or they bring something to me, we complete it in my kitchen. I like the company of other people who like to cook. It took me a while. At first I was a little shy about this, but one of the people I talk about in the book is Esther Press McManus, who grew up in Morocco. And the tradition there was always cooking in a community. There were always 3 or 4 cooks in the kitchen, never just one person. And she said to this day, she never likes to cook by herself. She always likes to have people around her, sort of encouraging her. And I've picked that up. I love people coming in and looking in the pot and seeing what's going on and making a suggestion. And so I hope I've answered that.
Yes.
Well, of course, you certainly need to have the chefs, but it is a chicken and egg thing because you won't have the chefs if you don't have the clientele, and vice versa. In the case of Philadelphia, I once asked one of the top restaurateurs there, a woman named Susanna Fu, how she thought the great restaurant renaissance got going in Philadelphia. And she said that she thought it was because Philadelphians, after World War II, began to travel. And in fact, she said because of World War II, a number of men from Philadelphia had been in Europe, had been exposed to European culture. And then after the war, went back with their families. And because of this travel, they were exposed to European cooking traditions. And when they came back, they wanted this for their city. Now, ironically, Philadelphia had an extraordinary cooking tradition in the early days. As we all know, it was the capital of the country at one time, and it was called the gastronomic capital of the United States in the 18th and early 19th century. There were great French chefs roaming the city, but when Philadelphia lost its political and financial prominence, it went into a slow decline that became most marked before and slightly after World War II. And when the demand began after World War II for better food, there's an old joke. I went to Philadelphia, but unfortunately it was closed. That would probably describe what people might have found in the early 50s if they tried to get a good meal out in the city. But the demand grew. The chefs were brought in the case of some French chefs like Georges Perrier. The chefs began to prepare themselves to open restaurants like Fritz in the late 60s. He had been a microbiologist, but he loved to cook and cooked meals for his friends, his community, and everybody said you should open a restaurant, and it was a perfect time to do it. And so these restaurants all began to grow up, and the restaurant renaissance, as it's been called, grew, and in a sense it's still growing. So that's how it happened in that city, and I'm sure you could find similar patterns in many other cities around this country. Personally, I think confidence has a lot to do with it. I was someone who was quite intimidated by the notion of cooking and cooking for company. I just thought I hate to say it, but I was raised to believe it was women's work. Not to put it down, I thought it was one of those secrets, one of those skills that women had that men simply didn't have. So Fritz gave me the confidence to cook because he showed that it could simply be done. He said, well, you just take this onion and slice it this way, and you throw it in the pan this way, and then you put this in and you put that in. I mean, he was doing it all with a certain amount of precision, but always with the sense that you don't be too serious about it and don't be too hidebound about it. Follow the recipe, but use your instincts, use your own taste. So I think that was simply having the confidence to do it is very important, and I learned that confidence from him. And then he was very insistent on tasting what you were making. He taught many times at the restaurant school in Philadelphia, and he had any number of apprentice chefs in his kitchen, and he was always asking them, did you taste it? And surprisingly often they would say, no. And Fritz would say, well, then how do you know what you've got? Taste what you're making, be in charge of what you're making, have an idea of what you want to make, and then proceed in that direction. It's not rocket science. I have a chapter called Roquette Science, and you can find out what roquette science is, or rocket. But it's not a deep and difficult mystery to master. Following a recipe is a skill to learn. Recipes are very handy. I use them. But if you don't have the confidence to use another ingredient when you don't have the one it calls for, when you don't have the confidence to taste it and say, not done. They said 10 minutes. I think it needs another 5 minutes. Fritz taught us ways, and there are ways in the book that you can do a very simple test of when a dish is done. Um, they're very simple, time-proven, from many, many family kitchens, including his grandmother's kitchen. Many ways to get a dish done successfully with a recipe and without a recipe. And when you do this, you feel like you're part of a very long and creative tradition. It feels very good to turn something out and put it on the table and have people enjoy it.